A millionaire was surprised to hear the song his lover used to sing many years ago, playing in the middle of the park. Not long after, he was shocked to realize that the girl who sang that song had a very deep connection with him. The day was still, but Edward's thoughts were anything but calm. In an effort to recover from yet another taxing business meeting, he strolled through the park. His head buzzed with numbers, strategies, and deals, the fruits of the empire he'd spent years building. A legacy that had brought him wealth beyond anything he had once imagined. But as he walked under the shade of trees, a profound loneliness gnawed at him, a void that no amount of success could ever fill. 25 years had passed, and the emptiness left by Charlotte, the woman he had loved so deeply, still haunted him. The memory of the day she disappeared remained vivid, as if it had only happened yesterday. One moment, they were making plans for their future together, and the next, she was gone. No explanation, no trace, just an abrupt absence. He had searched for her, of course, hired the best investigators money could buy, but they turned up nothing. Eventually, he buried himself in his work, convincing himself that success was all he had left. Yet no amount of achievement could erase her from his mind. Suddenly, a faint sound pulled him from his thoughts, a melody, soft and barely there, but clear enough to drift through the park like a whispered breeze. Edward stopped, his heart racing. That song. It was the very tune Charlotte used to hum whenever they were together. His eyes scanned the park, searching for the source. There, sitting on a nearby bench, was a young woman, completely lost in the music she was humming. Her head was slightly bowed, her long, dark hair falling softly over her shoulders. Edward approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. There was something about her that felt eerily familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. As he neared, his eyes widened. The young woman bore a striking resemblance to Charlotte, her delicate features, the same gentle expression. It was as if time had reversed itself, and a younger version of Charlotte was sitting before him, just as she had been when they first met. His pulse quickened as a deep sense of déjà vu washed over him. The young woman lifted her head, and their eyes locked. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. The likeness was uncanny. For a moment, he was speechless. He stood there staring, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Finally, he found his voice. "Excuse me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't help but notice the song you're humming. It's beautiful. Where did you learn it?" The young woman smiled softly. "Oh, it's something my mother used to sing to me when I was little. I guess it just stuck with me." Edward's heart pounded. He wanted to ask more, to press for answers, but he forced himself to stay composed. "That's interesting," he replied, keeping his voice steady, though his emotions were in turmoil. "It reminds me of someone I used to know." "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" he continued. "Victoria," she said, tilting her head as if trying to read him. "And you are?" "Edward," he responded, feeling the weight of her gaze. There was something about her, something more than just her appearance, that stirred a sense of recognition deep inside him. "Victoria," he repeated, almost tasting the name. It felt both foreign and familiar as it left his lips. Silence settled between them for a brief moment, with only the gentle rustling of leaves in the background. Edward's thoughts raced. Could this young woman be related to Charlotte somehow? Or was his mind playing tricks on him, projecting his lost love onto this stranger? "Are you from around here?" he asked, desperate to learn more. "I've lived here for a few years now. My mum and I moved around a lot when I was younger, but we've settled here for a while." Edward nodded, absorbing her words. His curiosity deepened. There was something here, a mystery he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd buried long ago. Hope. "Listen, Victoria," he said cautiously after a pause. "I don't want to impose, but I might have an opportunity for you. I run a business and we're always looking for talented people. If you're interested, we could discuss it further." Victoria seemed caught off guard by the offer, but a spark of interest lit up her eyes. "That's unexpected," she said with a small smile. "But I'm open to hearing more." Edward nodded, feeling an odd sense of relief. He wasn't sure what he was getting himself into. Something he couldn't just walk away from. As they exchanged contact information, his mind raced. He needed to know more about her, and this was the perfect way to do it. Maybe through Victoria, he could finally unravel the mystery of what had happened to Charlotte all those years ago. As he left the park, Edward couldn't shake the strange feeling that had gripped him. There was something about Victoria, something beyond the uncanny resemblance that tugged at. He had spent decades burying his emotions behind his business success, but now, those walls were starting to crack. The next day, as he sat in his office, the world of contracts and meetings felt distant. His thoughts kept drifting back to the park, to Victoria's face, to the melody she had hummed so naturally. The resemblance was too strong to dismiss, and the question gnawed at him. Who was she, really? Without giving it much thought, he picked up the phone and dialed her number. "Hello?" Victoria's voice was soft, a little surprised. "Victoria, it's Edward," he said, trying to sound casual. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'd like to formally offer you a position at my company. There's an opening I think might be a good fit for you." There was a pause. Edward could sense her hesitation on the other end of the line. "That's very generous of you, Edward, but I don't know much about your company, or what kind of work it would be," Edward assured her. "You'd start with something simple, and learn as you go. We could meet again to discuss the details." Another pause. Edward could almost hear her deliberating. "All right," she finally said. "I'll give it a try." That evening, they met again, this time at a quiet cafe. Victoria looked a bit nervous, but greeted him with the same warm smile. "I'm still not sure what I'm getting into," she admitted, settling into the seat across from him. Edward chuckled, feeling a strange sense of ease around her, something he hadn't felt in years. "It's nothing overwhelming," he said, "just an entry-level position where you can grow. If you're interested, I'd be happy to help you build a career." Victoria studied him, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Why are you doing this for me? You barely know me." Edward's heart skipped a beat. Why was he doing this? He wasn't entirely sure himself. Was it her resemblance to Charlotte, or something deeper? He wasn't ready to confront that question yet. "I believe in helping people with potential," he said instead. "And you seem like someone who deserves a chance." Victoria looked down, touched by his words. "I don't know what to say. No one's ever offered me anything like this before." "You don't have to say anything now," Edward replied, leaning back. "Just think about it. If you're ready, we can start whenever you like." After a moment, Victoria smiled and nodded. "All right, I'll give it a shot." They spent the next half hour discussing the job. By the end, Victoria seemed more relaxed, and she agreed to come to the office the following morning to finalize the details. As they wrapped up, Edward hesitated, then asked, "Victoria, you mentioned your mother used to sing that song. Does she live here in the city?" Victoria blinked, her expression softening. "Yeah, she does. We live together. It's just the two of us, though she's been sick for a long time." Edward's breath caught. His pulse raced, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm sorry to hear that. What's her name, if you don't mind me asking?" Victoria hesitated, her eyes flickering with a hint of caution. "Her name is Charlotte." Edward's heart stopped. Charlotte. Could it really be her? After all these years, after all the pain and searching, could the woman who had once been his entire world still be alive? Edward felt his throat tighten as a surge of emotions crashed over him. He wanted to ask more questions, to pry into the past, but he didn't want to alarm Victoria. "I see," he managed to say, keeping his voice steady. "I hope she's doing okay." Victoria gave a small, sad shrug. She has her good days and bad days. She doesn't really talk about the past. Sometimes it's like she can't remember, and other times it's like she just doesn't want to. Edward nodded, though his mind was spinning. He needed more information. But how could he ask Victoria if her mother was the same Charlotte who had disappeared from his life 25 years ago? It was too much, too soon. "I understand," he said casually, forcing a smile. "Maybe I'll meet her one day." Victoria returned the smile, though there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. Maybe. As they said their goodbyes, Edward's thoughts raced. He needed answers, but he knew he couldn't rush it. For now, he would focus on getting closer to Victoria, and maybe, just maybe, through her, he would finally uncover the truth about Charlotte. The days that followed were a blur. Edward's mind was consumed by the questions that refused to leave him alone. Was it even possible? Could Victoria's mother really be his Charlotte, the woman who had disappeared without a trace? He swung between disbelief and cautious hope, unsure of what to believe. But one thing was clear: he needed proof. His instincts, sharpened by years of navigating the ruthless world of business, told him that he couldn't just rely on coincidence. He needed something concrete. It was late that night when the idea struck him. He needed a DNA test. It was the only way to know for certain if Victoria was his daughter. The thought of it sent a chill down his spine. If it was true, then his entire life would change in an instant. Edward had always been methodical, and this situation was no different. He couldn't afford to scare Victoria off by confronting her directly with his suspicions. So, he formulated a plan. He just needed a small sample of her hair, something that wouldn't raise her suspicions. His stomach turned at the idea of deceiving her, but he convinced himself it was necessary. He had to know the truth. A few days later, under the guise of welcoming her to the company, Edward invited Victoria to his office to finalize some paperwork. She was eager to get started, and he could see a quiet determination in her. As they chatted and she signed the documents, Edward was distracted, waiting for the right moment. When Victoria reached to gather her things, her long dark hair brushed against the edge of the desk. There it was, his chance. In one smooth motion, he grabbed a tissue, pretending to wipe the desk, and discreetly collected a few strands of her hair. "Is everything all set?" Victoria asked, smiling at him. "Yes, everything's in order," Edward replied, his heart pounding with the weight of his secret. "You'll start on Monday, and we'll go from there." They exchanged pleasantries, and once Victoria had left, Edward sat down, staring at the tissue in his hand. His breath came in shallow bursts. He had what he needed. Now all that remained was to have the test done. 2 days later, Edward sat at his desk, staring at a sealed envelope. It had arrived that morning, and yet he hadn't found the courage to open it. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, heavier than any business deal or contract he'd ever held. What if he had been wrong? What if he had read too much into their resemblance, or worse? What if he had been right all along? His fingers trembled as he carefully tore open the envelope. The sound of the paper seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. His eyes scanned the document, his heart racing as he searched for the result. And then, there it was. The test confirmed a 99.9% match. Victoria was his daughter. The truth hit him like a wave, leaving him breathless. He leaned back in his chair, trying to grasp the enormity of what he had just learned. Victoria, his daughter. She had been out there, growing up without him, unaware of who her father was. And Charlotte, she had been alive all these years, raising their child. Guilt gnawed at him. He had spent so many years chasing wealth and success, never realizing what he had lost in the process. But there was something else, something that cut through the guilt. Hope. He had a daughter. He had a chance to be a father. He had an opportunity to reconnect with Charlotte, to rebuild the family he never knew he had. But how could he tell Victoria? He couldn't just drop this bombshell on her without any warning. She didn't even know he had once been with her mother. And what about Charlotte? What if she didn't remember him at all? He had to be careful. If he wasn't, he could risk losing everything all over again. That evening, Edward found himself walking through the park again, much like the day he had first heard Victoria humming. The air was cool, the sky growing dim as evening settled in. He needed space to think, to clear his mind before making any decisions. As he wandered through the familiar paths, memories of Charlotte flooded his mind. Her laugh, the way she used to look at him with those deep, soulful eyes. Edward had loved Charlotte with every part of himself, and losing her had been the most painful experience he'd ever endured. And now, after all this time, he was so close to finding her again. Would she remember him? And even if she did, could they ever rebuild what they once had, or only shadows of a life they'd planned together? He clenched his fists, the uncertainty tearing at him. He couldn't waste any more time. 25 years had gone by, and he had let his grief and work consume him, pushing everything else aside. Now, he had a second chance. A chance to know his daughter, to find Charlotte, and to finally uncover the truth of what had happened all those years ago. But first, he had to tell Victoria the truth. The thought of it made his stomach twist with anxiety. How would she react? Would she feel betrayed, knowing he had gone behind her back to discover this? Or would she be relieved to finally know who her father was? Edward stopped walking, gazing up at the darkening sky. He had no choice. She deserved to know. And no matter what happened next, he would face it. There was no more running, no more hiding behind the walls of his business. The next day, Edward picked up the phone and dialed Victoria's number. His heart pounded in his chest as the phone rang, his hands growing clammy. "Hello?" Victoria's voice was light, unaware of the weight hanging on this call. "Victoria, it's Edward. We need to talk." The heaviness of the words lingered in the air. Edward knew there was no turning back now. Victoria deserved the truth, even if it meant everything he had carefully built would unravel. His pulse quickened as he sat in his office, the phone still pressed to his ear, waiting for her response. "Talk about what?" Victoria asked, her voice curious but laced with nervousness. Edward swallowed, trying to steady himself. "It's important. I'd like to meet in person if you're available. Could you come by my office later today?" There was a pause on the other end, and Edward could feel her weighing the situation. "Sure, I can be there in an hour," she finally replied. "Great. I'll see you then," Edward said, ending the call. As he hung up, his thoughts raced. How could he explain something so monumental? Should he tell her everything at once, or should he ease her into it? He wrestled with the uncertainty, and time passed in agonizing silence. An hour later, a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Edward called, standing as the door opened and Victoria stepped inside. She looked the same as always, calm and composed, but there was an air of quiet strength about her that reminded him so much of Charlotte. He gestured for her to take a seat, trying to keep his expression neutral, though inside, his emotions were anything but calm. "So what's going on?" Victoria asked, her eyes searching his face. Edward hesitated, then decided he couldn't delay it any longer. He had to be honest. "Victoria, I need to tell you something. Something that might come as a shock." Victoria's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" Edward took a deep breath. "You mentioned your mother's name is Charlotte, and that she's been unwell for some time. I didn't say anything when you first told me, because I wasn't sure. But there's something you need to know about your mother and me." Victoria's eyes widened slightly, confusion and apprehension dancing across her features. "What are you talking about? You knew my mother?" Edward nodded, feeling the weight of the words. "Yes. A long time ago, Charlotte and I were very close. In fact, we were in love." Victoria blinked, clearly trying to wrap her mind around what he was saying. "You were in love with my mother?" "Yes," Edward confirmed, his voice softer now. "But then, one day, she disappeared. I spent years searching for her, but I never found out what happened to her. Not until now." Victoria's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" Edward's heart raced. This was the moment of truth. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the DNA test results. "I took the liberty of running a DNA test," he said gently, handing the paper to her. "It confirmed something I had suspected since the day I met you." Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she took the paper, her face growing pale as she scanned the results. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this can't be right." "It's true," Edward said softly, leaning forward. "Victoria, you're my daughter." For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Victoria's wide eyes darted from the paper to Edward and back again, as if searching for some mistake, something to explain away what was in front of her. "I'm your daughter," she repeated, her voice thick with disbelief. Victoria stood abruptly, pushing the paper away as if it had stung her. "No, this doesn't make sense. My mother never mentioned you. Not once. She never talked about my father. She always said he wasn't in the picture." Edward saw the storm of emotions swirling behind Victoria's eyes. Shock, confusion, anger. He couldn't blame her. This revelation wasn't something anyone could easily process. Standing up as well, he spoke with a calm, steady tone, though his own heart was racing. "I know it's a lot to take in, Victoria, but I swear to you, I didn't know. Your mother's disappearance, it was a complete mystery to me." Victoria turned away from him, gripping the back of the chair as if to ground herself. "If this is true, then why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she ever say anything about you?" Edward took a cautious step toward her, his voice gentle. "That's what I want to find out. Your mother's condition, her memory issues. Maybe she doesn't remember, or maybe it was too painful for her to talk about. But if you'll let me, I'd like to meet her. I want to understand what happened." Victoria's shoulders sagged, and she shook her head, as if trying to shake off the weight of it all. "I don't know, this is too much. It's all too much." "I know," Edward said softly. "I can't imagine how overwhelming this is for you. But I'm here. Whatever you need, whatever questions you have, I'm here to answer them." Victoria turned back around, her eyes searching his, looking for something. Reassurance, maybe, or perhaps the truth itself. "This is insane. I don't know what to believe." Edward stepped closer, his voice earnest, filled with sincerity. "Believe that I've been searching for answers for years. And now that I've found you, I don't want to lose the chance to know you." Victoria's breath hitched, and for a long, tense moment, she stood in silence, processing everything. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." Edward nodded, giving her space. "I understand. Take all the time you need. But I would like to meet your mother. I think it's important. Maybe it will help both of us understand what really happened." Victoria hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Okay, I'll take you to her, but I can't promise anything." Edward's heart swelled with a mix of hope and anxiety. This was the first step toward uncovering the truth, toward closure, and maybe even something more. The drive to Victoria's house felt like a lifetime to Edward. His thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of anticipation and fear as they navigated through city streets that soon turned into quieter, more residential roads. Every passing second brought him closer to the one person he had thought he'd lost forever. Charlotte, the love of his life, who had vanished without a trace. 25 years ago. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, barely speaking. He could feel the tension radiating from her. The weight of what they were about to face was heavy on both of them. He didn't push for conversation. He understood she needed time, just as he did. Finally, they pulled up to a modest house, tucked away on a peaceful street. It was simple, far removed from the life he and Charlotte had once dreamed of building together. "This is it," Victoria said quietly, breaking the silence as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "She's inside." Edward nodded, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions within him. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped out of the car and followed Victoria to the front door. Each step felt heavier, burdened by years of questions, guilt, and longing. Before unlocking the door, Victoria hesitated, glancing at Edward as if to give him one last chance to reconsider. "She doesn't remember much about the past," she warned. "Sometimes she has good days, but mostly she's just not the same person she used to be." Edward swallowed the lump forming in his throat and nodded. "I understand. I just need to see her." Victoria unlocked the door and led him inside. The house was quiet, the soft ticking of a clock the only sound in the stillness. The space was warm, lived in, with photographs of Victoria at various stages of her life adorning the walls. But there were no pictures of Charlotte from the years Edward had known her, no evidence of their life together. "She's in the living room," Victoria said, leading him down a narrow hallway. When they entered the room, Edward's breath caught in his throat. There, sitting in an armchair by the window, was Charlotte. Her once vibrant hair was now streaked with grey, and the years had etched lines into her face. Yet she was still unmistakably the woman he had loved, the woman who had haunted his dreams for decades. She looked up as they entered, her eyes distant, as though she were somewhere far away. There was no flicker of recognition when she saw him, no spark of memory. She smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile you give a stranger. "Mum," Victoria said gently, stepping forward. "This is Edward. He's someone I wanted you to meet." Charlotte tilted her head, her expression curious but clouded. "Edward," she repeated, her voice soft, unfamiliar. "Do I know you?" Edward's heart clenched with a painful thud. He had tried to prepare himself for this, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality. She didn't remember him. The love they had shared, the life they had planned, it was all gone, erased from her memory, as if it had never been. I don't know," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we were very close once, a long time ago." Charlotte's brow furrowed slightly, as if she were trying to grasp at something just out of reach. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "I don't remember much these days. Things from the past, they get blurry." Victoria watched the exchange with sadness in her eyes. She had lived with this version of her mother for years, but for Edward, this was a new and heartbreaking reality. She could see the pain etched into his face as he grappled with the truth. "Maybe you two can talk for a while," Victoria suggested quietly. I'll give you some space." Edward nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. How could he talk to Charlotte, knowing she didn't remember him? But he wasn't ready to walk away. Not again. Victoria left the room, leaving Edward and Charlotte alone in the quiet. The silence between them was heavy, and Edward finally broke it. "You used to hum a song," he said softly, sitting down across from her. "A melody that I heard not too long ago. Victoria was humming it, just like you used to." Charlotte's eyes flickered with something, perhaps a trace of recognition, but it was faint. "I used to sing," she said slowly, her voice distant, "but I can't remember why." "You sang it to me," Edward said gently, leaning forward, "when we were together." Charlotte frowned, her gaze drifting to the window. "Together?" Edward's voice trembled, filled with longing and the weight of all the years lost. "Charlotte, you were my world. Once. We were going to build a life together. And then you disappeared. I searched for you for years, but I never found you." Charlotte's expression remained blank, though her eyes clouded over, as if something deep within her was struggling to break through. "I don't remember," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "I don't remember." The silence in the room felt suffocating, and Edward's heart sank. He'd been foolish to think this would be simple. There were too many years between them, too many broken fragments of her memory that couldn't be mended with mere words. He was about to lose hope when, suddenly, Charlotte's hand reached out, resting lightly on his. Her touch, warm and familiar despite the fog in her eyes, sent a jolt through him. "I don't remember," she repeated, her voice soft, "but I feel like I should." Edward's breath caught in his throat. It was a small flicker, but it was there. Hope. "Maybe, in time you will," he whispered, holding her gaze. Charlotte nodded slightly, her eyes still distant, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of recognition, as if the woman he had loved so long ago was still there, hidden beneath the years of forgotten memories. And for Edward, that was enough to hold on to for now. In the days that followed, Edward visited Charlotte often. Sometimes Victoria was with him, other times he sat alone with her, trying to piece together fragments of the past. Each visit felt like an emotional tightrope, suspended between hope and heartache. Charlotte remained distant, her memory a patchwork of vague recollections and long stretches of silence. But every now and then, Edward glimpsed something, a word, a gesture, that reminded him of the woman he had once known. One afternoon, Edward arrived at the house to find Charlotte sitting by the window, her fingers tracing the outline of a flower on the windowsill. Victoria had gone out, leaving them alone once again. "Hello, Charlotte," Edward greeted her softly, taking his usual seat across from her. She looked up at him, her expression as gentle as ever, though her eyes still held that faraway look. "Hello, Edward," she replied, her voice quiet, as if she were still trying to fit him into a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light, even as the weight of his emotions pressed down on him. Charlotte hesitated, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I've been thinking about something. Something from long ago," she murmured. "But it's blurry." Edward's heart skipped a beat. This was how it often started, these fleeting fragments of memory, small threads that might lead to something more. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. "What do you remember?" Her brow furrowed as she traced the flower's edge again. "A man," she said slowly. "I think I loved him, but it feels like it was from another life. He used to hold me, and we would talk about our future. We were going to get married, I think." Edward's chest tightened. "Do you remember his name?" he asked gently. Charlotte frowned, frustration creasing her face as she struggled to grasp the memory just out of reach. I don't know. It's like it's right there, but I can't reach it. Edward swallowed hard, fighting the urge to push her further. He wanted so desperately for her to remember, to look at him and see him as the man she had once loved, not a stranger. But he knew he couldn't force it. The memories would come back, or they wouldn't, in their own time. "It's okay," he said softly, trying to ease her frustration. "Take your time. Sometimes memories come back when we least expect them." Charlotte sighed, her fingers pausing their tracing. "It's been so long, hasn't it? I feel like I've forgotten so much of my life. Some days, I wonder if I'll ever remember it all." Edward nodded, his heart heavy with her sadness. "Whatever you remember, it's enough. We'll take it one step at a time." They sat in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. Edward couldn't help but wonder if Charlotte would ever remember more, if she would ever truly recognize him again. But as he watched her, he realized that even without her memories, there was still something of her left, the way she moved, the way her voice softened when she spoke. It was all still there, buried beneath the confusion and the years of loss. Then, unexpectedly, Charlotte spoke again, her voice quieter, more uncertain. "I keep seeing a face," she said, trembling slightly. "A man with dark eyes. I don't think he was the one I loved, but he's there, in my memories. Like a shadow." Edward stiffened. "A man with dark eyes, could it be?" His mind raced. "Do you remember anything else about him?" he asked, careful to keep his voice calm, though tension coursed through him. Charlotte closed her eyes, her face tightening in concentration. "He was angry. I don't know why, but he scared me. I think he took me somewhere. I remember being afraid, and then nothing. Everything goes dark." Edward's heart pounded in his chest. Samuel. It had to be. Charlotte's ex-husband, his former business partner, had always been jealous of the connection Edward shared with her. For years he had harbored suspicions about Samuel's involvement in Charlotte's disappearance, but he had never been able to prove anything. But hearing Charlotte mention his name again stirred up a wave of old doubts. Could Samuel have been the mastermind behind it all? Was he the one responsible for Charlotte's disappearance all those years ago? Edward's fists clenched as he struggled to control the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't let Charlotte see his turmoil, especially now when her memories were just starting to resurface. Still, the anger simmering inside him was hard to push down. If Samuel had done this, if he had taken Charlotte away, "What else do you remember about him?" Edward asked gently, though his voice was tight with tension. Charlotte shook her head, her eyes still closed. "Not much, just bits and pieces. He was furious and I was terrified then. Everything went dark." Edward forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions building inside him. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. He needed clarity, needed to piece together what really happened before jumping to conclusions. "Thank you for sharing that, Charlotte," he said softly, reaching out to touch her hand with a gentle reassurance. "You don't need to remember everything all at once. We'll figure this out together." Charlotte opened her eyes, and for a split second, a glimmer of recognition flickered in them. A fleeting moment, but enough to spark hope in Edward. "I don't know if I'll ever remember it all," she whispered, "but I think I was happy once. With him." Edward's chest tightened, but he managed to offer a small smile. "You were," he said softly, "and you can be happy again. We'll take it one day at a time." Charlotte gave a faint smile, her hand resting in his. For the first time in years, Edward felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. But as that hope started to grow, a darker thought gnawed at the edges of his mind. Samuel. If Samuel had been involved in Charlotte's disappearance, Edward knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he uncovered the full truth. And he wouldn't stop until justice was served. He couldn't shake the weight of Charlotte's words from their last conversation. Her mention of a man with dark, angry eyes, frightening, tied to her vanishing, left a deep suspicion gnawing in his gut. Everything pointed to one person, Samuel, his former business partner. Samuel, who had once been close but had carried jealousy and resentment for years. The more Edward thought about it, the clearer it became. Samuel had always been possessive, especially when it came to Charlotte. Back then, Edward had shrugged it off as simple envy, thinking their friendship and business could survive those tensions. But now, with fragments of Charlotte's memories resurfacing, it was harder to ignore the possibility that Samuel's involvement ran much deeper than Edward had ever imagined. He couldn't face this on his own. Edward realized he needed answers, and the only person who could help him uncover the truth was Charlotte, if her memories came back in time. But Victoria also deserved to know. She had spent her whole life in the dark, unaware of what had truly happened to her mother. It was time for her to know the full story. The next afternoon, Edward met Victoria at a cafe near her home. She sat across from him in silence, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and confusion that had been there since he revealed the truth about her parentage. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me," she began, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "About my mom, and about you being my father. It's still hard to wrap my head around." "I get that," Edward replied, his tone steady but serious. "It's a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to accept it all right away. But there's something else you need to know. Something about your mom's past that I think is starting to come back to her." Victoria frowned, placing her cup down.
"What do you mean?"
Edward leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Your mother has been remembering things. Small fragments of her life before she vanished. She's mentioned someone. A man with dark eyes, someone who scared her, someone she believes took her away." Victoria's eyes widened. "Are you saying she was kidnapped?" Edward nodded, his jaw tightening. "I think so. And I believe that man was Samuel, my old business partner. He knew your mum back then, and I've always suspected he had feelings for her. But I never imagined he'd go so far as to take her and keep her hidden." Victoria stared at him, incredulous. Why would he do that? And why didn't anyone figure it out? "I don't know the whole story yet," Edward admitted. "But if Samuel was behind this, he must have been careful. He had the money, the connections, enough to make her impossible to find. That's probably why she ended up in that small village, with no memory of anything." Victoria's face darkened, her hands gripping the edge of the table. So all this time, she's been living with that trauma without even knowing what really happened to her. "Yes," Edward said softly, the weight of guilt heavy on him. "I never thought Samuel could do something like this. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't." Victoria shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "So what do we do now? How do we prove it was him? It's been so long, and my mum barely remembers anything." "We have to tread carefully," Edward cautioned. "I don't want to push your mum too hard. If more memories come back, we'll have something solid. But we also need to be ready for Samuel to try and cover his tracks. He's still out there, and I wouldn't be shocked if he tries to interfere." Victoria's jaw clenched, her determination evident. "He can't get away with this, not after everything he's done to her and to us." Edward nodded, a surge of pride swelling in him at his daughter's resolve. "We'll get justice, Victoria. I promise you that. But first, We need more information before we can confront him. Your mother holds the key to all of this. Victoria stayed silent for a moment, clearly wrestling with her emotions. But eventually, she looked up at Edward with determination in her eyes. I'll help. Whatever it takes. If my mom can't remember everything, we'll find another way. But we can't let him get away with this. Edward reached across the table, resting his hand gently over Victoria's. Thank you, he said quietly. We'll get through this together. I'll protect both of you no matter what. That evening, Edward returned to Charlotte's house, hoping to uncover more clues. He found her sitting by the window, gazing out at the fading sunset. There was a calmness about her, but also a lingering sadness that seemed to always be present. Hey, Charlotte, he greeted softly, sitting down beside her. She turned toward him, her expression distant, though more focused than before. Hey, Edward, she responded, her voice carrying a hint of recognition. Do you remember anything from earlier? Edward asked gently, searching her face for any signs of her memories resurfacing. Charlotte frowned slightly, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with the edge of her blanket. I've been thinking about that man again. The one with the dark eyes. Edward's chest tightened. What do you remember about him? She hesitated, her brow creasing as she tried to focus. He was angry. I remember being scared of him. He said he loved me, but it didn't feel like love. It felt wrong. Edward's fists clenched at her words. Samuel, it had to be him. Did he take you somewhere? Do you remember where he brought you? Charlotte's face tensed, and she shook her head slowly. I don't know. Everything went dark after that. I don't remember much, just fear. And then I woke up far away, alone. Edward's heart broke for her, but beneath the sorrow was a burning fury. Samuel had done this. He had stolen Charlotte away, ripped her from the life they were building, and left her to suffer in isolation, stripped of her identity and memories. Thank you for telling me, Charlotte, he said softly, taking her hand in his. We'll figure this out. I promise. Charlotte's eyes searched his for what felt like a long, heavy moment. Then, for the first time since their reunion, she spoke with a clarity that made Edward's heart skip a beat. I think I was trying to get away from him, she whispered. But something went wrong. Edward's pulse quickened. This was it, another piece of the puzzle. With every new fragment of memory, the truth was slowly coming into focus. He left Charlotte's house that evening with a renewed sense of purpose, a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The pieces of Charlotte's past were starting to align, and the truth of what had happened was becoming more apparent with each passing day. Samuel had to be held accountable, but Edward knew they needed more than just Charlotte's fragile memories to bring him to justice. The next morning, Edward met with Victoria at his office to go over their plan. They sat in the conference room, papers spread across the table as they worked to piece together events from so long ago. We need to gather as much evidence as we can, Edward said, his voice steady but serious. It's been 25 years. Memories alone won't be enough to convict Samuel. We need witnesses, documents, anything that ties him to your mom's disappearance. Victoria nodded, her expression hard with determination. Do you think there are still people who might remember something? I mean, it's been so long. There might be, Edward replied. Samuel had a lot of connections back then, and not all of them were on the right side of the law. If we can find someone who was involved or knows about what he did to Charlotte, they might be willing to talk now. Victoria leaned back, fingers tapping on the table's edge. What about the village where she ended up? Maybe there are people who remember her arriving, or who saw something suspicious around that time. Edward nodded thoughtfully. That's a good lead. If anyone remembers the details of her arrival, like who brought her there, or anything unusual, that could be useful. Victoria crossed her arms, a flicker of worry crossing her face. But even if we find people who remember, will they be willing to testify? Samuel was powerful. He could have threatened them, or worse. Edward sighed, considering her words. You're right. Some may be too scared to speak out, but we'll have to try. If we can build a strong enough case, people might feel safer coming forward. But we'll need to move carefully. Edward's jaw clenched at the thought. We'll deal with that if it comes to it, he said firmly. But we need to start somewhere. If we can find even one person willing to talk, it could inspire others to come forward. Victoria hesitated, then asked the question they'd both been avoiding. What if Samuel finds out what we're doing? What if he tries to stop us? Edward met her gaze, his voice calm but resolute. He won't. I won't let him. I've spent years building my business, avoiding messy situations like this. But this is different. This is about your mother, and now it's about you too. Samuel can't hurt us anymore. Victoria nodded, though her shoulders remained tense. She had grown up in an atmosphere of fear, always looking over her shoulder, and the thought of facing Samuel head-on was terrifying. But she trusted Edward. He had already shown her that he was willing to do whatever it took to protect their family. A few days later, Edward and Victoria drove to the small village where Charlotte had lived after her disappearance. It was a quiet, tucked-away place in the countryside, unremarkable, except for the weight it carried in their lives. As they pulled into the village square, Edward felt a knot of unease in his stomach. This was where Charlotte had been left alone, with no memory of who she was. It was painful to imagine the loneliness she must have felt, lost and unaware of her own past. They started by talking to a few of the locals, cautiously asking if anyone remembered a woman named Charlotte arriving years ago. At first, they got little more than polite shrugs. Most people didn't seem to recall anything unusual. But after a few more conversations, they found an older woman who seemed to remember something. I remember her, the woman said, her voice soft with empathy. She showed up out of nowhere. No one knew where she came from, and she barely spoke. It was as if she didn't know who she was. Edward's heart began to race. Did you ever see anyone with her? A man, maybe? The woman paused, thinking, then shook her head. No. Not that I can remember. She was always by herself when I saw her. But there was a rumor, back then. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes wide with interest. What kind of rumor? The woman nodded. Some folks said they saw a man drop her off late at night, but no one ever figured out who he was. He vanished right after, and she never mentioned him. Edward exchanged a quick glance with Victoria, his pulse racing. Finally, they had something. A lead. Do you remember anything else? Edward pressed gently. Anything about the man, or how Charlotte seemed when she arrived? The woman paused, thinking, but eventually shook her head. I'm sorry. That's all I can recall. After that, she kept to herself. It wasn't until much later that she started having those episodes. Episodes? Victoria echoed, frowning. The woman nodded sadly. Yes, she'd forget things or get confused about where she was. Over time, it got worse. Folks around here tried to help, but there wasn't much we could do. Edward thanked the woman for her time, though his mind was already racing. This lined up with what he'd feared. Charlotte had been abandoned in the village, likely by Samuel, and her memory had deteriorated soon after. But they needed more. Hearsay and rumors weren't enough to build a solid case. Later that evening, back at Edward's office, he and Victoria sorted through the information they'd gathered. While it wasn't enough to directly link Samuel to the crime, it was a start. The rumor about a man dropping Charlotte off was significant, but without concrete evidence, it wouldn't hold up. "I've been thinking," Edward said, pacing the room. "Samuel had a network of people, contacts from his shady business deals. If we can track down someone who worked for him back then, someone who knew about his personal life, we might get the proof we need." Victoria nodded, though her expression remained tense. "But how do we find those people?" Samuel was good at covering his tracks. Edward stopped pacing, his mind sharp with determination. "I still have connections in the business world, people who know people. Samuel may think he's untouchable, but he's wrong." Victoria met his gaze, her own resolve clear. "Then let's do it. Whatever it takes, we'll find the truth." As Edward began making calls, chasing down leads and piecing together their case, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The puzzle was coming together, and he was inching closer to exposing the man who had taken everything from him: his love, his family, his future. But deep down, Edward knew that once they cornered Samuel, things could get dangerous. This wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore. It was about righting a wrong that had shattered their lives. And Edward was ready to fight for Charlotte, for Victoria, and for the justice that had been denied for far too long. He knew confronting Samuel directly was a dangerous gamble, but it was a risk he had to take. The pieces were finally coming together. And while they didn't have every shred of evidence, they had enough to put pressure on Samuel. More importantly, Edward knew that both Victoria and Charlotte deserved answers. They couldn't wait any longer. Through his network of old business contacts, Edward had tracked down Samuel's location. Despite the passage of time, Samuel was still a man of immense power, shielded by his wealth and influence. But Edward had something Samuel didn't: the truth. And once that truth came to light, it could dismantle everything Samuel had built. "Are you sure about this?" Victoria asked, sitting across from Edward in his office, her voice edged with anxiety as they prepared for what was ahead. Edward met her gaze, his expression steady. "I'm sure. We can't let him get away with this any longer. It's time he faced what he did." Victoria nodded, though Edward noticed the unease in her eyes. She was ready, but the gravity of what they were about to do weighed on her. She had never been part of this world, the world of secrets, deceit, and the kind of betrayal that came with power. But she had inherited her mother's strength, and that reassured Edward. Whatever they faced, they would face it together. They drove to Samuel's estate in silence, the tension in the car thick. Both of them knew this confrontation could unfold in countless ways. As they neared the massive mansion, Edward felt a flood of memories, years of business dealings, once close friendship, and eventually the bitter unraveling of everything that had tied him to Samuel. He never imagined they would end up like this, on opposite sides, with the truth about Charlotte's disappearance hanging between them like an executioner's blade. "Stay close to me," Edward told Victoria as they stepped out of the car. "No matter what happens, don't let him provoke you. We'll face this together." Victoria nodded, her jaw set with resolve. She had every reason to be furious, but Edward didn't want her emotions clouding her judgment. Samuel was a master manipulator, and no doubt he'd try to turn the situation in his favor. Edward was ready for that. As they were led into Samuel's study by his staff, the room felt just as intimidating as Edward remembered. Samuel was seated behind a large oak desk, his eyes gleaming with the same smugness that had always unsettled Edward. He rose as they entered, a smile tugging at his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, well, Edward," Samuel said, his voice oozing with insincere warmth. "What brings you here so unexpectedly?" Edward skipped the pleasantries. "We need to talk about Charlotte." A flicker of surprise crossed Samuel's face before he masked it with indifference. "Charlotte?" Samuel repeated, pretending confusion. I haven't heard that name in years. Why bring her up now? Edward stepped forward, locking eyes with Samuel. Don't play dumb. We know what you did. Charlotte is alive, Samuel, and she's starting to remember. The tension in the room thickened. Victoria stood beside Edward, fists clenched, but silent as they had agreed. Samuel's smile faded, his face turning colder. I don't know what you think you know, Edward, but you're making a big mistake coming here with these accusations. I'm not here to accuse, Edward replied, his voice steady yet firm. I'm here to give you a chance to come clean. You took her. You ruined her life and mine. Now it's time to pay for what you've done. For the first time, something darker flashed in Samuel's eyes. Maybe anger, maybe fear. He stood slowly, his hands gripping the desk as he leaned in. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said, his voice low. Don't I? Edward shot back, stepping even closer. Charlotte remembers you. She remembers the fear, the anger, and how you ripped her away from everything she loved. She may not have all her memories back yet, but it's only a matter of time. Edward's words cut through the room as Samuel's eyes narrowed. Edward could see his composure beginning to slip. You're a fool, Edward, Samuel spat. You always have been. Everything you had, your success, your wealth, even Charlotte, it was all handed to you, and you never appreciated any of it. That's what you couldn't stand, isn't it? Edward shot back, his voice steady despite the heat rising inside him. That she chose me. That's why you took her. Samuel's face twisted with fury, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. I did what had to be done. Charlotte was better off without you. She needed someone who could give her a real life, not someone who was too busy with deals and meetings to see what he had. Edward felt the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he refused to let it take over. You didn't give her a life, Samuel. You stole it from her. And now, she's finally going to get it back. Samuel sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You think you can just walk in here after all these years and tear me down? I built this empire from the ground up. I won't let you or anyone else destroy that. This isn't about your empire, Edward said firmly. It's about justice. For Charlotte. And for Victoria. He gestured toward his daughter, standing resolutely beside him, her eyes blazing with the same determination that made Edward proud. You didn't just take Charlotte from me. You took her from her own daughter. Samuel's gaze flicked to Victoria, and for a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a bitter smile. So, that's what this is about, he said with a cold laugh. You found your little lost family, and now you want to play the hero. I'm not here to play anything, Edward said sharply. I'm here for the truth, and for you to pay for what you did. For a moment, Samuel's face darkened, and Edward braced himself, half expecting an outburst. But instead, Samuel let out a low, mocking chuckle. You really think you can expose me? Bring me down. I have more power and more connections than you could ever imagine. Edward's gaze never wavered. We'll see. You're not untouchable, Samuel. Not anymore. Before Samuel could respond, Victoria stepped forward, her voice clear and unshaken for the first time. You took my mother from me. You took everything from her. But we're going to make sure the world knows the truth. You can't hide behind your money and lies forever. Samuel's eyes flared with fury, the mask finally slipping. Before Samuel could utter another word, Edward stepped forward, closing the space between them. His voice was calm, but firm. This is your last chance, Samuel. Confess, or we take this public. You know we have enough to ruin you. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Samuel locked eyes with Edward, his face tight with barely contained rage. After what felt like an eternity, he finally straightened, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Get out of my house," he growled. "You'll regret this, Edward. Both of you will." Edward didn't flinch. "We'll see," he replied, his voice steady. He motioned for Victoria to follow, and together they walked out of the mansion. The air outside was crisp and liberating, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere they had just left behind. "We did it," Victoria whispered, her voice laced with a mix of relief and lingering anger. Edward nodded. "Yes, but it's not over yet." They had forced Samuel's hand, but now the real work began. Samuel would fight back, and Edward knew they had to move quickly to make sure Samuel faced justice for everything he had done. Back at his office, Edward wasted no time. He immediately began calling in every favor he had amassed over the years. Lawyers, private investigators, business associates, anyone who could help dig into Samuel's past and expose the secrets he had worked so hard to bury. Edward's connections were vast, and he knew that Samuel had crossed paths with some less than savory characters. If they could find just one person willing to talk, they'd have the leverage they needed to bring him down. Victoria was equally determined to do her part. She returned to the village where Charlotte had been found and sought out the older woman who had first remembered Charlotte's strange arrival. This time, the woman shared more details about the man who had brought Charlotte there. "He only came at night," the woman recalled. "Always in a hurry, always looking over his shoulder. We all thought something wasn't right, but no one knew his name. Charlotte started acting odd soon after. We figured he had something to do with it." Victoria took this new information back to Edward, who passed it on to his investigators. They immediately began tracking down leads, focusing on anyone who had worked with Samuel during that time. They hoped to find someone who had been part of Samuel's scheme to abduct and hide Charlotte, someone with enough information to finally bring Samuel to justice. The confrontation had only strengthened their resolve. Samuel was rattled, and that made him vulnerable. And in Edward's experience, desperate men always made mistakes. Within a week, they hit the jackpot. One of Edward's private investigators had tracked down an old associate of Samuel's, a man named Charles. Years ago, Charles had worked with Samuel on a few shady deals, and he had been a part of the network Samuel used to cover his tracks. When the investigator contacted Charles, the man was clearly on edge, reluctant to get involved. He didn't want to talk, didn't want any part in reopening the past. But with enough persuasion and the promise of protection, Charles agreed to meet Edward in person. A few days later, Edward and Victoria sat across from Charles in a secluded booth at a small, out-of-the-way restaurant just outside the city. Charles looked worn down, the weight of hidden secrets visible in the creases of his face. His eyes darted nervously around the room as though he feared being watched. Finally, he slid into the booth, his shoulders hunched as he kept his voice low. "You've got guts digging into Samuel's past," Charles muttered. "He's not the type to let things go." Edward remained calm, his tone steady. "We know what he's capable of. That's why we're here." Charles hesitated, clearly uneasy, but Edward pressed on. "You helped him hide Charlotte, didn't you?" Charles exhaled a shaky breath, rubbing his hand over his thinning hair. "I didn't know the whole story back then. I thought it was just business. Samuel was always wheeling and dealing, making moves to stay ahead. But when he came to me and said he needed someone handled, I should have known it was more than just business." Victoria's fists clenched in her lap, her knuckles white, but she stayed silent, her anger barely contained as Edward continued. "So, you helped him," Edward said, leaning forward. "You helped him take Charlotte and disappear her." Charles shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking between Edward and Victoria. I didn't know who she was, okay? All Samuel said was that she was causing trouble, that she was a distraction he didn't need. I took care of the logistics, got her out of the city, set her up in that village under a new name. After that, I was out. I never saw her again. At that, Victoria's voice finally cracked through the tension, shaking with barely suppressed fury. You stole my mother's life. You helped him take everything from her. Do you even realize what you did to her? To us? Victoria's voice trembled with raw emotion. Charles couldn't bring himself to look up. Guilt etched across his face. I never thought it would go this far, he admitted quietly. I figured she'd be all right. But then Samuel got paranoid. He started paying me to keep tabs on her, make sure she stayed hidden. By then, I was in too deep. Edward leaned in, his eyes burning with resolve. You're going to help us take him down. You've already confessed your part. Now, you need to testify. We can protect you if you come forward. Charles hesitated, fear flashing in his eyes. You don't get it. Samuel's got connections. He could destroy my life if I cross him. Victoria leaned closer, her voice calm but sharp. He already destroyed ours. He took my mum from me, tore apart everything she had. Don't you think it's time he faces what he's done? Charles stared at the table for what felt like an eternity. Finally, his shoulders sagged as if the weight of it all had finally broken him. All right, I'll testify. I'll tell you everything. With Charles' cooperation, Edward didn't waste a second. His legal team jumped into action, collecting all the evidence they had gathered over the years. Charlotte's medical records, statements from witnesses in the village. Charles's testimony became the key. Once they had his statement, everything else fell into place. In no time, Edward's lawyers filed a lawsuit against Samuel, and the media latched onto the story. It wasn't long before headlines were everywhere, exposing the shocking details of Samuel's role in Charlotte's abduction and manipulation. Edward and Victoria watched it all unfold, a mix of satisfaction and apprehension swirling inside them. Samuel, who had once seemed untouchable, was now being dragged through the public eye, forced to answer for his crimes. It wasn't long before he was arrested, his empire crumbling under the weight of his lies. In the courtroom, Edward and Victoria sat side by side, witnessing the fall of Samuel's arrogance as the mountain of evidence brought him to his knees. Charles's testimony had been damning, and as the trial wore on, more witnesses stepped forward, people who had worked closely with Samuel, who had seen the extent of his ruthless actions firsthand. Piece by piece, the case against him solidified, leaving no room for doubt. Finally, the day came when the verdict was read. Samuel was found guilty on multiple charges, including kidnapping, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The sentence was severe, and as the judge announced Samuel's fate, Edward felt a surge of relief wash over him. Justice had been served. Walking out of the courtroom, Edward turned to Victoria, his heart heavy with both pride and sorrow. We did it, he said quietly. Victoria nodded, though her expression was somber. Yeah, but it doesn't give us back all the years we lost. Edward placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. No, it doesn't. But we have now. We have the future. And that's something Samuel can never take from us. Victoria offered a faint smile, a glimmer of hope, finally breaking through the sadness in her eyes. I guess that's true. They had won the battle, and for the first time in years, Edward felt that maybe, just maybe, they could finally start to heal. The trial had come to an end, and with it, the weight that had been pressing on Edward, Victoria, and Charlotte for so long began to lift. Samuel was now behind bars. His once mighty empire crumbled to dust. The world had seen him for what he truly was, a manipulative, dangerous man who had destroyed lives for his own selfish gain. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of closure. But as Edward stood outside the courthouse with Victoria by his side, he knew that the real work had only just begun. Justice had been served, but the emotional scars left by Samuel's actions would take time to heal. Charlotte had endured more than anyone ever should, and while fragments of her past were slowly coming back, they were still fragile and incomplete. She would need time, just as Edward and Victoria would. That evening they visited Charlotte, sitting with her in the small living room of the house where she had spent so many lost years. Victoria had made the decision to move in with her mother for a while, to help care for her as she continued her long journey of recovery. And for the first time, there was a sense of peace, however tentative, settling over them all. Charlotte had her ups and downs, and though her memory was gradually returning, there were still parts of the past she struggled to reclaim. Edward sat across from her, watching as she absent-mindedly smoothed the blanket on her lap. There was a new stillness in the room, a kind of peace that hadn't existed before, as if the heavy burden of secrets and lies had finally lifted, allowing space for something new to take root. "Do you feel different now that it's all over?" Charlotte asked softly, her gaze drifting toward Edward. Her voice was steady, but there was an undertone of uncertainty, as if she feared what his answer might be. Edward smiled gently. "Yes, I do. It's not the closure I expected, but it's something. It means we can finally start moving forward." Charlotte nodded, though her expression remained pensive. "I've been thinking about that, moving forward. It's strange, isn't it? I spent so many years not knowing who I was, not remembering anything about my past. And now, even with some memories coming back, I still feel lost." Victoria, sitting beside her mother, reached over and took her hand. "You're not lost, Mom. You're here with us now, and that's what matters." Charlotte smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know. I wish I could remember everything. I want to be who I was before, but I don't even know who that is anymore." Edward felt a twinge of sadness hearing her say that. He understood the disorientation, the sense of not belonging to your own past. But he also knew that Charlotte didn't need to be who she had been. Edward felt a twinge of sadness hearing her say that. He understood the disorientation, the sense of not belonging to your own past. But he also knew that Charlotte didn't need to be who she had been. Be there to support her. "You don't have to remember everything," Edward said softly. "What's important is that we're together now. We'll take it one day at a time, just like we've been doing." Charlotte looked at him, her expression softening. "You've changed, Edward," she said quietly. "You're not the same man I remember." Edward offered a faint smile. "A lot has changed, but some things haven't. I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped hoping." Charlotte's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and for a moment, they simply sat there in the quiet, letting the silence speak. There were no words that could fully express the years of loss, pain, and longing they had both endured. But now, with the truth out in the open, they could begin to rebuild, slowly, carefully, but together. Over the next few months, life slowly found its new rhythm. Victoria continued working at Edward's company, gradually carving out her place in the business world while embracing her role as his daughter. It wasn't always smooth. The weight of everything they had been through still lingered, casting shadows in quieter moments. But with each passing day, their bond grew stronger. Charlotte, too, was finding her footing. She started therapy to help navigate the trauma and the gaps in her memory. Though the process was slow, there was progress. Some days the weight of her past threatened to overwhelm her, But there were also moments of light, laughter with Victoria, quiet talks with Edward, moments where she could almost feel whole again. Edward, meanwhile, devoted himself fully to supporting Charlotte and Victoria. His business continued to thrive, but it no longer consumed him the way it once had. The years of pain and isolation had taught him that there were things far more valuable than power or success. He had a family now, a family that had been shattered and then painstakingly pieced back together. That was worth more than any business deal. One evening, a few months after the trial, the three of them gathered in the backyard of Charlotte's house, enjoying the warm summer air. Victoria had picked up dinner from one of their favorite spots, and they ate quietly, the soft sounds of the evening surrounding them. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the yard, Charlotte glanced at Edward, her expression serene. "I've been thinking," she said softly, setting her drink down. "About what's next?" Edward raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Charlotte smiled, a flicker of her old self showing. "I don't want to live in the past anymore. I've spent too many years there. I want to move forward, to start living again." Victoria smiled and reached over, gently squeezing her mother's hand. "That's a wonderful idea, Mom." Edward nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "I couldn't agree more. Whatever you want to do, we'll be right there with you." Charlotte looked at both of them, her smile widening. "I think it's time to sell this house. It's been my safe haven for so long, but it's also tied to everything that happened. I want to find someplace new, somewhere we can all start fresh." Edward and Victoria exchanged a glance and nodded in unison. "Then that's exactly what we'll do," Edward said, his voice full of determination. "We'll find a new place and begin again." Charlotte's eyes sparkled with emotion as she looked at the two people who meant the most to her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude, "for never giving up on me, on us." Edward smiled, his heart full. "We're a family, Charlotte, and we always will be." As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and purple, the three of them sat together in the soft, fading light. They had been through more than most families ever should, but now, with the shadows of the past behind them, they could finally look toward the future with hope, a new beginning, a new life together.